The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the singular, most important historical event in the Bible, in your life, and really in all of history. It started, as you guys know, some of the largest religious movements in history. We're not going to acknowledge and celebrate necessarily all of those, such as, the wars and various things are at it. But whether we like it or not, the resurrection of Jesus Christ has impacted billions of lives throughout history. Some of it's been incredibly good, and some of it has been, ugh. We don't necessarily want to attach ourselves to some of the ways that people claim Jesus. See, this historical event, it's not, July 4th, 1776 is a pretty significant day. The day that the printing press was invented was another very important day. When we discovered antibiotics, that was another important day. But the historical event that has had the greatest impact on the world as we know it today was the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I say this morning that this historical event is the key to understanding the Bible and Christianity. And I say this because generally, as you guys know, if you've turned on the news in the last 15 years, multiple presidents, etc., and Christianity can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. We can have multiple presidents going in completely the opposite direction talk about Jesus positively. We can have, we can have gun rights connected to Christianity. We can have taking away gun rights connected to Christianity. I don't even know how they connect, but people do. And so they go in all the different directions. It's impacted quite a few people, quite a few viewpoints, and we've all seen it. And Christianity can, at times as we look at it, we can honestly wonder to ourselves, is this what Christ was about? Is this even what Jesus cared about? Is this what Jesus wanted? And I invite us all to just stop for a minute and let's sort of wind Christianity down into one critical historical event. And this event was so important, not only to us, but it was also incredibly important to Jesus. See, oftentimes we talk about Jesus and the resurrection, we talk about it in the past tense, right? I mean, it has almost happened, depending on, how we date things, almost 2,000 years ago. But we're still talking about that is in the past. That is a long time in the past. Many of us can't even remember what happened yesterday. And we're talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago. But we are actually going to take the perspective actually before the events even happened. And a conversation between one of Jesus' most important disciples, his sort of head follower, head disciple, Peter, and Jesus, and actually a pretty awkward confrontation between the two. So if you guys are there, Matthew chapter 16, Matthew 16, verse 21 through 27. Still in 1 Corinthians. It should be good if I should get there. It says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But as he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man gain in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, that there are some standing there who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And verse 28, we're not going to talk about today, because verse 28 serves as sort of the door to next week, which will be in Matthew chapter 17. It's sort of because back in the day, they didn't have these fancy chapter points and all these verses, but verse 28 leads us and propels us into the next one. So we're going to be spending our time on verses 26 through 27. The first thing I would like to say is, to Jesus, there is nothing more important than his death, burial, and resurrection. Last week, for those of us who were here, I was not, so I listened online. Leslie was talking about Christianity's persistent questions and this war between the right Twix and the left Twix. I thought that was pretty funny. Jesus, and what he says is, we can oftentimes get sidetracked with this issue with Peter. Is Peter the Pope? Is Peter this? What's this? What this? And that passage that we studied in earlier can just become this debate point where we actually miss the main point, and that Jesus is the Son of the living God. He is the Messiah. And Peter boldly proclaims this and becomes the spokesman of the Spirit, pretty much. He's like, man. And then we read this passage, and Peter turns into the spokesman for Satan. Talk about two different directions. See, Jesus begins to teach them, as it says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. Now, I want to think to yourself, okay, so when we follow political leaders, or when we follow Heisman Trophy winners and football players and baseball players, and when we follow our heroes, you know what the last thought in our mind is? They'll die. I mean, for football, the last thing in our mind is our favorite player is going to be traded. Because now who do you cheer for? You just don't know. It just gets really confusing. And here he is, and Peter has just boldly said, I believe you are the Christ or Messiah. And to Peter, when he's saying that, man, that means he's going to be the next political leader of Israel. He's going to kick those Romans in the hiney and get them out of there. This is a big deal. And then Jesus proceeds to then teach them how he's going to die. And Peter was not okay with this. See, in the Bible, no one could grasp the fact that Jesus would die and rise again. No one was waiting for Jesus at the tomb. No one. People doubted. His closest followers could not fathom what Jesus was saying. And I say this to reinforce, if you are visiting with us today, maybe you've been coming off and on as well, and you aren't quite sure about this whole Jesus dying and rising again thing. You know what? You are in great company. His own followers didn't even believe him. This is just weird. Humanly speaking, when I even hear people like, I was dead on the operating table for 30 seconds before they woke me up, I'm like, you weren't dead then. Well, my heart stopped beating. They brought you back to life. You weren't dead. But I stopped breathing. Don't care. Okay, I mean, you can say, but that's just how my mind works, because the resurrection, humanly speaking, makes zero sense. Can we all admit that? People don't rise again. I mean, Frankenstein is a pretty fun, book and idea. Zapping people with lightning bolts, all it does is burn people and fry people. It doesn't bring anyone back to life. Dead things don't get up again. That's why zombie movies, they're all fun and stuff, but guess what? They're not real. When you're dead, you're dead. And so when Jesus is talking to them, hey, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. They're like, no, you're not. Jesus is like, yes, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. No, you're not. Yes, I am going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And however this played out, it's just sort of summarized here, but it bothered Peter so much because remember, Peter is now the spokesman for the Holy Spirit, okay? He has been empowered. He knows who Jesus is, and he knows flat out that Jesus isn't going to die. And so he goes, and he pulls them aside. He says, this is never going to happen to you, Jesus. Have you guys ever been pulled aside and rebuked? Isn't that a very, like a sort of a fun and awkward conversation at the same time? Especially when you think you're right. I mean, have you guys ever had that happen before? You were rebuked for something you pretty much would do every single time you ever had that chance to do it again? So you're like, you're rebuking me for something I will do again and again and again and again and again. Okay, thanks. And how do you usually respond in those situations? I mean, think to yourself. I mean, here's Peter. He's like, come here, Jesus. Come here. Come here. We got to have a chat here. This is never going to happen to you. Jesus is like, oh, thank you. I was totally wrong here. Appreciate this. No, how did Jesus respond? Get back! You spokesman of the devil. Whoa, hold up there, Jesus. How about we simmer that down? I'm just telling you, you're wrong. No, this is it. It's just boom. Whoa. And I wonder, you have your other disciples there, and sometimes you're trying to listen in on conversations like we know we're not supposed to do, but we totally do anyway. And so here's Peter, and he's being quiet, Jesus, we can't have this, dude. You're the Messiah, and you're not going to die. And I don't think Jesus whispered it back to him. Get behind me, Satan. Doesn't carry the same force, does it? Jesus, this is probably what the disciples heard. They all have their hands to the door. Bah! Boom! And Peter just gets slammed with an insane rebuke. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, you guys all have your arch nemesis, in life. Maybe it was somebody in school, but that person was always the one who was maybe slightly faster than you, or the one who was just slightly better at you than everything. They became sort of your arch nemesis. Maybe you guys didn't have one of those. I totally did. It happened in soccer. It was that one person who could beat you sometimes, and suddenly your whole life became, I'm going to beat this person, and I'm that man. And sometimes it becomes fun, but sometimes, ladies, have you ever had someone who you really didn't like, and pretty much every conversation was somehow, how could you stab the other person in some backstabbing way? Became like a knife fight. And so we've all had our arch nemesis. Now just imagine this. Satan is the arch nemesis of Jesus. Everybody knows it. God and Satan versus each other. Jesus has now identified Peter as the ambassador, the representative of his arch enemy. This is not a compliment. There's no way you can say this. You are now representing the very person I come to destroy. See, Peter, his right-hand man, was so adamant that this sacrifice, this death on the cross, this being killed and all this other stuff, he was so determined that it wasn't going to happen. He pulls him on the side. He says, Jesus, you are wrong. But if we want to be very specific, what Peter actually tells Jesus is, this isn't in God's plan for you. It doesn't make any sense. Messiahs don't go to Jerusalem to die. Messiahs can't. This is not how it works. In a way, Peter's also saying who you are as the Messiah prevents bad things from happening to you. If you think about that, how many times in life do we say, I can't serve a God who lets bad things happen? That is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible allows bad things to happen to even his precious Son. That is a hard thing for me to swallow. Because I don't like bad things. Do you guys all like bad things? No, if you do, then that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Bad things you can't like. It says you are wrong. This isn't in God's plan, Jesus. Who you are as the Messiah prevents anything bad from happening to you. And he says, get behind me. You are a hindrance. You are preventing my walk and my path. He says, for you are not, and I like this, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. See, man does not believe that something dead could ever live again. Because when people die and things die, they die. We know this because of the amount of death that many of us have seen year after year after year after year after year and heard about time after time after time after time. Death, whether we like it or not, is a very natural physical occurrence. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around this. Man also, generally speaking, does not pursue investments that happen after you die. Because what happens when you die? You can't cash in on your $1 million lottery. You can't. You're dead. Man focuses on the here and now because to most people, that is all there is. This is a very natural human thing. And Peter just responds and does, can I say that any one of us would do in his position? Jesus. That doesn't happen. See, but to Jesus, his death, his burial, and his resurrection was the most important thing in his ministry. It drove him to the path that Peter, his closest follower, had become a hindrance. Jesus is like, no, get back. This is where I'm going. And it reveals to us as we read this, there is nothing more important to Jesus than this. This is what's going to happen. A lot of times we can get distracted with his really cool miracles and his really cool teachings. But none of that would have mattered if he did not die and rise again. Have you guys heard the phrase, Jesus is either a liar, he is a lunatic, or he is Lord? Because think about it. He has let's try to take a natural perspective with it. Jesus said some really cool things. Jesus also said some pretty crazy things. Wacky things. If we try to take Jesus as a whole, either he just proceeded to walk around lying to everybody, or he was nuts. Who would say, love and serve your fellow man, and pick up your cross and follow me? Right into the loony bin of I'm going to die and rise again. It doesn't. Can we be honest? If we bring the bulk of his ministry together, if the resurrection hadn't happened, he sounds like a wacko. It does. There's no point in listening to it if it doesn't happen. There's no point. The guy's crazy. It all hinged on this. Jesus' whole ministry was directly going and walking towards this event that would become a historical event that would that would just spread throughout the entire world. And so he responded to Jesus. This was the most important thing. Charles Colson, a special counsel to President Nixon, during the whole, Watergate scandal thing, his life really changed around towards, the end. And I encourage you to, check that out. But he says this really cool quote, where he says, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put into prison. They would not have endured it if it wasn't true. Watergate pretty much embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world. and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me that 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Impossible. Just need to say it's. Yeah. I just don't even know where to go with that, because it's like, okay, I mean, you would think the most powerful men in the known world could keep alive. Just all the connections you can connect this with in politics. Okay, we just got to keep moving for that one. But to Jesus, this event drove him. And then he begins to teach his disciples. In verse 24, he says, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. And he continues that. And so Matthew has combined these two in sort of one big thing that sort of hinges off of what happened last week in the week, as we've been seeing it. So here he goes. And this next point here in verses 24 through 27, I want to say to us, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ transforms our life. So we've just left a powerful rebuke that emphasizes how important this, at that time, future event is to Jesus. Jesus then begins to explain the call of discipleship and the need to follow him. He says, if you claim you follow me, and he says, and you do not have a singular focus, you will lose your life. He says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And we talked about that here a few weeks ago. This is not picturing this as I'm going to die, but when you take up your cross and you were chained and bound, heading on your way to die, you were guarded by Roman soldiers. You could not overpower your chains and somehow fight off the Roman guards guarding you as you walk through the town. There was only one thing going to happen, and that was eventually your death. You guys have seen movies, and maybe you've had the experience with death row. You are given your last meal, and always you're sort of walked out, and you're being guarded by all of these people as you walk down to eventually give your life. You don't escape. And Jesus is saying, if anyone would come after me, if anyone wants to follow me, he's saying, stop focusing on you and your life, and I need you to get on this one-way path and follow me. And he begins to explain what this truth means, and he says, for whoever loses his life, he says, for whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Jesus says, if you focus on what is happening right now in your life, what you end up doing is you end up losing it. And we can say, like, if you talk to people, if you've read any biographies and a variety of things, what happens when somebody is on their deathbed is the last thing on their mind is, I wish I could have earned more money. If only I had just gotten some more money. Man, if only I had made that investment in Apple and invested in Windows and definitely invested in Amazon. Then no one thinks like that on their deathbed. All everyone cares about is being around those people that matter to them. And what Jesus is saying, if you spend your whole life investing in the now, you lose it. He says, I need you to invest in something more important than that. And see, as we look at these passages from what Jesus has just talked about with the resurrection, what we begin to see is stop focusing on what is going right now in your life, but focus on part 2. After you're dead, focus on something that actually has some meaning. Focus on something that is a little more important that happens. And he says, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? And he's saying you could gain everything in the world and lose the thing that actually matters, and that is your soul. Because your soul is invaluable. There is no price you can put on how important you are. And as we know, when Jesus Christ came and died and gave him his life, he gave an invaluable gift for what he viewed as an invaluable soul. You were that important to him. And he says, for the Son of Man is then going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father. And he sort of grabs the entire New Testament history, shoves it into like a few verses. See, the truth of the resurrection is critical to living like Jesus wants you to. The soul is incredibly valuable. The soul, your soul lives past your life. It doesn't end. And to win your soul, he's saying, you must invest in something beyond your life. Because if you're just giving for what is happening now and what is happening on earth and all the things that the earth promises you and all the blessings and what culture says, if you're just investing in that, what's actually going to happen is you're going to lose it. Because when you die, you die. And all that stuff that you earned is nothing. But he says, invest in something beyond that. And what Jesus has been trying to share with his disciples and his followers, those who are listening to him, through Matthew, where we are now, Matthew 16, is he is worth the investment. Because he gave his life. He didn't just care about what was going on in his life. He gave it for something invaluable. He gave it for you and for me. And so the resurrection begins to guide our understanding in this, because he says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels and the Father in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Sounds like judgment here. And what he says is there is a resurrection. Because why would it matter if we just died and all just died and nothing else happened? Then why would it matter that Jesus Christ comes back and judges? It doesn't really carry any meaning. When someone dies, I mean, technically their debt is just handed over to somebody else. You can't really get that person. They're just dead. And anything you could have said, you can't say now. Anything, any partnership, any way to work in that person or any apologies or whatever, it's too late. But what Jesus is saying is here is when you die, eventually I am going to come back. I am going to repay each person according to what he has done. What Jesus is saying is there is a resurrection for each and every one of us. And we will go and we will have to stand. As Jesus comes back, he will judge what you have invested in. And whether it's the things of the earth or whether it's something that actually lasts. See, the resurrection of Jesus begins and should begin to change our lives and how we view our life. It changes how we see death. Because as we see death, we no longer see it as an event where you die and that is it, but we begin to see that's only part one of your life. And now you have part two. See, in part two of your life, Jesus is going to hold accountable all your deeds. And so, as I said earlier, if you've turned on the news and we've been around and you guys have looked around and you've seen Christianity means so many different things, but I want to ask you guys, I want us to get us focused here, is Jesus says that there is nothing more important in his life than his death and resurrection. And he says the same thing for us now. There is nothing more important in your life than the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because Jesus can die and rise again. Eventually, all of us will rise again, and we will be accountable for what we did in our life. See, so why should Christians share their faith with others? Because there's a part two in their life. Why should Christians live for others instead of themselves? Because there is a part two in life. And God will honor those sacrifices. Now, why can Christians take ridicule and one day be martyred? And because there's a part two in life, and there is no need to fear the future. Why can't a Christian take up his cross and become singular-minded and follow Jesus? Because at the end of that road, and for some of us, death, there is a Savior who's waiting for you, because he, as we know, he died and he rose again 3 days later. If he has the power to do it, he is the first one. He becomes a sense of first fruit, and he's saying, hey, this is worth the investment. He is worth it. Don't focus on things of your life, because no person can raise themselves up. Some of us can't even do it physically right now. We have to have someone help us get up. But Jesus, as it says here, he says, Jerusalem, he will be killed on the third day and be raised. He will rise again. And this is what Jesus is trying to get us to stop and just consider for a second. Does the resurrection of Jesus guide your life? Because there was nothing more important to Jesus than this. It was his mission, it was his goal, it was his purpose for being on earth. And to us, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus should transform our life. I just want to throw this out there. So I'm talking a lot about the death and resurrection, and there are some, quite possibly out here, who are still just examining it and just checking it out, and maybe they're just like, this is dumb. And I would just really like to, just say, hey, it's worth spending a few minutes and just checking out if the claims are true. It's worth checking out and reading a little bit on it. Because in the grand scheme of your life, if it isn't true, and if it doesn't matter, then you have spent just a few hours, few days of your life figuring out if it's a worthwhile investment. There's nothing wrong with just checking the claims out and just, I don't know. There's nothing, it's not like it's going to destroy your life if you spend a few days or a few weeks studying the Bible. It's not. It's not going to destroy your life at all. How many of us have read and spent time on a book we wish we hadn't? Maybe it was an economics class, in college or something like that. Like, I wish I'd have gotten those few hours back. It doesn't kill you. It's worth investing, because if you find, as Jesus says, and what we believe is a historical event, this event will transform your life. Because if Jesus died, and if Jesus 3 days later rose again, that means there is something that happens after death. That means there's something that matters. That means what's going on in life now actually has eternal ramifications. It's worth spending a few minutes on and studying. So I encourage you to do it. I encourage you to check it out. It was the most important thing in Jesus' life. And hopefully to many of us, it is the most important thing in our life.